10 Johnny Carson guests who had zero shame. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson invited America into his television home each night. Behind that warm smile and Midwestern charm was television's greatest student of human behavior, a man who could read guests like no one else in the business. But there were certain stars who made even the unflappable Carson sweat. Guests who refused to play by the rules, who treated The Tonight Show like their personal playground, and who left producers in panic and Carson scrambling to maintain control of his own program. Johnny had a special signal for these guests, revealed a former Tonight Show director who worked alongside Carson for over a decade. He'd discreetly touch his ear while smiling, and our entire control room would know, this one's about to go off the rails. Buckle up. Most shocking were the guests who deliberately hijacked Carson's carefully structured format, turning interviews into chaotic spectacles that left the host visibly struggling to regain control. One actress infamously threw a drink at another guest on live television, while another celebrity's unhinged behavior prompted Carson to abandon the interview entirely and cut to commercial, a nearly unprecedented move in his disciplined career. Tonight, we're revealing the 10 guests who pushed Carson to his absolute limits, the boundary breakers and chaos creators who demonstrated what happened when celebrities decided that shame was simply something that happened to other people. But first, we need to understand the woman who didn't just break Carson's rhythm. She shattered it completely and occasionally reduced America's most controlled television host to a man desperately searching for an exit strategy.
We're both in the board of directors of the Actors Studio. We know each other a long time.
Shelley Winters, the Hurricane in Pearls. When Shelley Winters appeared on The Tonight Show, control left the building. The 2-time Academy Award winner approached television interviews like natural disasters, approached coastlines, with unstoppable force and zero concern for what got damaged along the way. She didn't just steal the spotlight, she lit it on fire, recalled a camera operator who worked many of her appearances. Most guests followed Johnny's lead, respecting the format, understanding the give and take of a talk show interview. Shelley treated the interview format like a suggestion that didn't particularly apply to her. Before Winters even reached the set, the backstage energy would shift. Production assistants would whisper warnings to each other. Makeup artists would draw straws to see who had to work with her. The guests scheduled to appear after Winters would often find their segment dramatically shortened or even bumped entirely, casualties of what staff called the Winters time vortex. Johnny would glance at his watch 3 minutes into her segment and realize with horror that they were already 15 minutes behind schedule, explained a Tonight Show writer. Her stories had stories. Her digressions had digressions. It was like watching someone navigate a maze blindfolded. You never knew where she was going, and neither did she. What made Winters particularly challenging wasn't just her disregard for television timing, but her complete comfort with creating uncomfortable situations. Where most celebrities carefully avoided controversy, Winters seemed drawn to it, making political statements, calling out other stars by name, and occasionally sharing intimate personal details that left Carson visibly searching for a safe transition. Most guests feared awkward silences above all else, noted the writer. Shelley created them deliberately. She'd drop a bombshell statement and then just sit back, watching Johnny scramble to react. It was like she enjoyed the 5 seconds of panic that flashed across his face before his professional instincts kicked in. The infamous purse incidents became a running concern for producers. Winters would arrive carrying an oversized handbag that functioned as a prop department for her chaotic performances. Without warning, she might suddenly dig through it, producing photographs, letters, or once, most memorably, a bikini that she held up against herself, asking Carson if she should wear it on her upcoming vacation. We started having production assistants try to casually check what was in the purse before she went on air, admitted a former producer. But she guarded that thing like it contained state secrets. The purse became this unstable element that could derail a carefully planned segment at any moment. While viewers found Winters' unpredictability entertaining, they didn't see the backstage behavior that truly earned her Carson's private disapproval. According to multiple staff accounts, Winters could be brutally demeaning to young employees, particularly women, making cutting remarks about their appearance, intelligence, or future prospects in the industry. Johnny had a rule, explained an NBC executive who worked closely with Carson. You could treat him however you wanted on camera. That was part of the job. but treating his staff poorly was unforgivable. When he heard how Winters had reduced a young female page to tears with a vicious comment about her weight, something permanently changed in how he viewed her. The breaking point came during a now legendary appearance when Winters, frustrated by a comment from another guest about aging actresses, threw her drink across the set. The moment created exactly the kind of unplanned drama television executives fear most, genuine conflict that couldn't be neatly resolved before the next commercial. Johnny was livid, remembered the camera operator. He maintained his composure on air. He always did, but during the break, he took Winters aside and said something none of us could hear. Whatever it was the only time I ever saw her look genuinely chastened. When they came back from commercial, she was noticeably subdued. Despite these tensions, Carson continued to book Winters throughout his tenure. Her star power and undeniable screen presence created memorable television moments that audiences loved, regardless of the chaos they caused behind the scenes. But staff noticed her appearances became less frequent over the years and were carefully structured to minimize potential damage. She was like a tornado you invited into your house because you needed the ratings, reflected the producer. Eventually, Johnny developed a system. Book her as the last guest so she couldn't derail the entire show. Never pair her with a guest she might clash with. And always build in extra time, because a 15-minute Shelley Winters segment existed only in some parallel universe where the laws of physics work differently. But if you thought Winters' chaos was merely accidental, wait until you meet the comedian who deliberately shattered television taboos, bringing raw truths about race, addiction, and American hypocrisy that had network censors hitting the delay button with unprecedented frequency.
It turns in on me. I have to get out and do something. But this is exciting for me, just to know that, hey.
Richard Pryor. Raw truth with zero apologies. When Richard Pryor settled into the guest chair on The Tonight Show, NBC censors moved to high alert. The revolutionary comedian approached television appearances with a radical concept. He would be exactly the same person on Carson's mainstream show that he was in his groundbreaking concert films and albums. No filtering, no sanitizing, just unvarnished truth delivered with genius-level comedic skill. Pain, jokes, and total honesty all at once, observed a Tonight Show writer who witnessed many of Pryor's appearances. Where most comics developed a tamer, television version of their act, Richard refused that compromise. The network might bleep him, but he wouldn't censor himself. That stance alone was revolutionary in the 1970s and early 80s. Pryor's Tonight Show appearances became masterclasses in navigating the tension between authentic artistic expression and network television constraints. He would address topics that were rarely, if ever, discussed on mainstream TV. His drug addiction, his multiple marriages, his troubled childhood, and most significantly, his unfiltered observations about race in America. The network executives would have these pre-appearance meetings where they'd establish boundaries for Richard's segments, recalled an NBC Standards and Practices representative from that era. It was almost comical. They'd create these elaborate guidelines, Johnny would dutifully communicate them, and then Richard would walk out and immediately, casually step across every line they'd drawn. Not maliciously, he just couldn't be anything other than completely himself. Perhaps the most shocking demonstration of Pryor's zero-shame approach came during a 1980 appearance following the freebasing accident that had left him severely burned, an incident widely reported as a suicide attempt. Where most celebrities would have avoided the subject entirely or offered a sanitized explanation, Pryor addressed it head-on with his characteristic brutal honesty. He sat down and said to Johnny, "You know what I learned? Fire is not a good recreational activity," remembered a cameraman who was present that night. The audience gasped, then nervously laughed, but Richard just kept going, talking openly about freebasing cocaine on national television when most stars wouldn't admit to having a glass of wine. It was like he was determined to be honest, even if it destroyed his career. What made these moments particularly powerful was Carson's response. Unlike his reaction to guests who created chaos through lack of discipline, Carson showed remarkable respect for Pryor's deliberate boundary pushing. He seemed to recognize that beneath the shocking language and explicit references was something precious, complete artistic integrity. Johnny had this look he'd get with Richard that was different from how he looked at any other guest, noted someone who worked closely with Carson. It was this mixture of admiration and fascination, like he was witnessing something he respected enormously but could never do himself. Johnny lived within careful boundaries his entire career, Richard obliterated boundaries as an artistic statement. They were opposites. Yet Johnny clearly revered Richard's freedom. This respect was evident in how Carson handled the network pressure that inevitably followed Pryor's more controversial appearances. When executives complained about language or subject matter, Carson would reportedly defend Pryor vigorously, arguing that his artistic importance transcended conventional standards of appropriateness. After one particularly raw appearance, a senior NBC executive called Johnny directly to complain, revealed a producer who witnessed the aftermath. Johnny listened politely, then simply said, "He's the most important comedian of his generation. If you want him on the show, you get all of him. If that's a problem, I understand, but I won't ask him to be less than he is." The matter was dropped. What viewers at home couldn't fully appreciate was how Pryor's refusal to shame extended beyond just language and subject matter to a deeper authenticity about his own struggles. At a time when celebrities carefully managed their public images, Pryor spoke about his addiction not as a conquered past problem, but as an ongoing battle, sometimes won, sometimes lost. He'd talk about getting high the previous weekend or struggling with sobriety that very day, the writer continued. There was no pretense of having everything figured out, no performative recovery story with a neat bow on it. Just raw, sometimes uncomfortable honesty about how hard it was to be Richard Pryor on any given day. For early 1980s television, that level of authenticity was nearly revolutionary. Carson's willingness to provide a platform for Pryor's unfiltered voice represented a significant evolution in mainstream television. By treating Pryor with evident respect, rather than as a shocking novelty, Carson helped legitimize a more honest approach to difficult subjects that had previously been considered inappropriate for network TV. Johnny understood what Richard was doing wasn't just pushing boundaries for shock value, observed a television historian who has studied both men's careers. He recognized that Pryor was using comedy to tell deeper truths about American society, race relations, and human frailty. By giving that voice a mainstream platform without demanding it be diluted, Carson played an important role in expanding what was possible on television. While Pryor used his shamelessness to reveal painful truths, our next guest had mastered a very different art, transforming scandal itself into a carefully calculated brand, decades before reality television made this a common career strategy. Zsa Gabor. Scandal as a personal brand. When Zsa Gabor swept onto the Tonight Show stage in a shimmer of diamonds and perfume, viewers were treated to a masterclass in what one producer called professionally engineered shamelessness. With her exaggerated Hungarian accent and theatrical declarations of "darling" punctuating every other sentence, Gabor had transformed indiscretion from a liability into her primary product. She made Scandal into a brand, noted a television critic who covered her numerous Carson appearances. Long before celebrities had strategic social media presences, Zsa intuitively understood that her private life could become more valuable than her acting career if she presented it as ongoing entertainment. She didn't just accept publicity about her scandals, she deliberately generated it. What separated Gabor from truly unfiltered guests was the calculated nature of her outrageousness. Every seemingly spontaneous revelation about her 9 marriages, her jewelry collection, or her romantic escapades was in fact a carefully crafted performance designed to maintain her celebrity status despite a waning acting career. She would arrive with a mental list of outrageous things she planned to say, revealed a Tonight Show booking agent who handled many of her appearances. She knew exactly which anecdotes would generate headlines the next day, the particular ex-husband she would skewer, the specific celebrity she would claim had pursued her romantically. None of it was truly spontaneous, but she created the perfect illusion of unplanned candor. Carson recognized this performance aspect of Gabor's persona and became her perfect foil, reacting with exaggerated shock to revelations he knew were coming, while giving the audience subtle winks that acknowledged the game they were both playing. It created a form of meta-entertainment, Gabor pretending to be spontaneously indiscreet, while Carson pretended to be surprised by it. Johnny understood exactly what she was doing and played along perfectly, observed a cameraman who worked many of her appearances. He would act shocked at her revelations while giving the audience knowing looks that essentially said, "Can you believe this woman?" It was a dance they performed together, with Carson playing the somewhat scandalized straight man to her outrageous socialite. What made Gabor's appearances particularly notable was her willingness to discuss her many marriages and divorces with casual frankness during an era when such matters were rarely addressed so openly on television. She would brazenly evaluate her ex-husband's shortcomings, compare their romantic capabilities, and discuss financial settlements with a cavalier attitude that was shocking for the time. She once told Johnny, "I am very good housekeeper. Every time I divorce, I keep the house," recalled a Tonight Show writer. The audience roared, but you have to remember this was at a time when divorce still carried significant stigma, especially for women. Zisa didn't just acknowledge her divorces, she wore them as badges of honor and transformed them into comedy material. Her shamelessness extended to her flirtatious behavior with Carson himself. Unlike most female guests who maintained professional decorum, Gabor would openly flirt with the host, touching his arm, commenting on his appearance, and suggesting romantic possibilities had they met under different circumstances. She would lean in close, look him directly in the eyes, and say something like, "Johnny Darlink, if I were 30 years younger, your wife would have serious problems," remembered a production assistant. Carson would get this half-embarrassed, half-delighted look that was priceless. He clearly enjoyed the performance while recognizing it was exactly that, a performance. Behind Gabor's carefully constructed frivolity lay a shrewd understanding of celebrity economics. At a time when aging actresses were typically discarded by Hollywood, she had created a persona that actually became more valuable with each passing year and each additional scandal. Her apparent shamelessness was, in reality, a brilliant business strategy that kept her relevant and employed long after her conventional acting career had ended. She turned having no shame into a marketable commodity, reflected a Hollywood historian familiar with Gabor's career. In an industry that typically punished women for aging and for having complicated personal lives, Zsa found a way to monetize both. Every divorce, every lawsuit, every public spat became content that extended her brand rather than damaging it. It was remarkably forward-thinking for that era. For Carson, Gabor represented a particular type of guest, someone who would reliably deliver entertaining television without the unpredictability of truly unfiltered personalities. Their tacit agreement, she would be outrageously indiscreet within carefully understood boundaries, and he would react with perfect, calibrated shock, created segments that satisfied audiences while remaining comfortably within the host's control. Johnny once described her as entirely artificial and completely authentic at the same time, revealed a producer who worked closely with Carson. He meant it as a compliment. She had created this outrageous character called Zsa Gabor, and committed to it so thoroughly that it became genuinely entertaining. She never broke character because the character was her livelihood. If Gabor's shamelessness was calculated, our next guest's lack of filter came from a far more potent source, a British actor whose liquid courage transformed a standard interview into a terrifying high-wire act that had Carson signaling for help.
And people that came to America, it seems to me, because they thought that they were either economically or socially or religiously persecuted.
Oliver Reed, unfiltered, unsteady, and completely uncensored. The moment Oliver Reed stepped, or more accurately, lurched, onto the Tonight Show stage in July 1979, Carson's producers knew they had a crisis on their hands. The British actor, known for powerful performances in films like Oliver and Women in Love, was visibly, undeniably intoxicated, slurring his words, swaying slightly in his seat, and fixing Carson with the unnervingly intense stare of someone working very hard to appear sober. He was 3 bourbons in and still demanding more, remembered a stage manager who witnessed Reed's pre-interview preparations. When a production assistant tried to bring him water instead, Reed growled, "I didn't ask for bloody water, did I?" in that booming voice of his. You could feel the panic rippling through the staff. This was live television with an unpredictable, uninhibited star who clearly had no intention of playing by the rules. What followed was one of the most uncomfortable yet fascinating interviews in Tonight Show history. Reed lurched between topics with no logical connection, interrupted Carson repeatedly, and occasionally lapsed into British pub songs complete with lyrics that had the censors frantically hitting their delay buttons. The audience's reaction evolved from initial amusement to a kind of collective anxiety as Reed's behavior became increasingly erratic. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, described a camera operator who worked that night. Johnny was visibly calculating in real time, trying to figure out how to salvage the interview without embarrassing Reed completely or cutting him off mid-segment. At one point, Johnny looked directly into the wrong camera and mouthed what appeared to be, "Help me," to the director. For Carson to break the fourth wall like that, even momentarily, showed how desperate the situation had become. Unlike some of Carson's regular troublemakers, who understood the boundaries of network television, Reed seemed either unaware of or completely unconcerned with American broadcast standards. He peppered his rambling stories with profanities, made sexual references that were graphic even by late-night standards, and generally behaved as though he were in a London pub rather than on national television. What made it particularly challenging was that beneath the slurring and the inappropriate comments, Reed was occasionally brilliant, noted a Tonight Show writer who witnessed the appearance. He'd suddenly deliver this perfectly articulated insight about acting or filmmaking, and you'd glimpse the formidable talent beneath the alcohol. Then just as quickly, he'd veer back into completely incoherent territory. It made it impossible for Carson to simply shut the interview down. Those moments of lucidity kept everyone hoping he might pull it together. The situation reached its most tense point when Reed, in the middle of a disjointed story about filming in Spain, suddenly focused on a woman in the audience and called out, "You there, in the red dress, you're a lovely bit of crackling, aren't you?" Before Carson could intervene, Reed had invited the visibly uncomfortable woman to join him after the show, adding several suggestions about what they might do together that required immediate censoring. Carson gave the cut signal to the director, remembered a producer, who was in the control room. We went to commercial about 2 minutes early, which almost never happened. During the break, Johnny leaned over and said something very brief to Reed. We couldn't hear what was said, but Reed's face changed completely, like a scolded schoolboy suddenly realizing he'd gone too far. When they returned from commercial, Reed was noticeably subdued, answering Carson's questions with uncharacteristic brevity and making a visible effort to sit more upright and speak more clearly. The remainder of the segment proceeded without further incident, though the earlier tension had created an atmosphere that never fully dissipated. That was Johnny's unique genius, reflected the producer. He somehow communicated to Reed that he had one chance to pull himself together or the interview was over, and he did it without ever making the audience aware that such an ultimatum had been delivered. Reed actually apologized to Johnny after the show. He mumbled something about jet lag and medication, the usual excuses, but he seemed genuinely embarrassed once he had sobered up a bit. Reed's appearance became legendary among Tonight Show staff as an example of Carson's ability to handle even the most challenging guests without losing his composure or humiliating them on air. Where a lesser host might have played up Reed's condition for laughs or cut the segment entirely, Carson found a middle path that protected both the show's integrity and the actor's dignity. The amazing thing about Johnny was that he never took advantage of a guest's vulnerability, the writer observed. He could have easily made Reed the butt of jokes or emphasized his condition for cheap laughs, but that wasn't his style. Even with a guest who was causing him enormous professional stress, Carson maintained a basic respect for their humanity. He would guide, redirect, even firmly establish boundaries, but he wouldn't humiliate. Reed never returned to The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure, one of the few guests who earned what staff called the permanent clipboard notation, indicating they should not be booked again regardless of their current popularity. But his single appearance remains a testament to the unpredictable nature of live television and Carson's extraordinary ability to navigate even its choppiest waters. While Reed's shamelessness stemmed from liquid courage, our next guest had something far more potent. The fearlessness of Hollywood royalty who, after decades of acclaim, had absolutely nothing left to prove and no one left to impress.
Have this one on me, your man.
Bette Davis, Hollywood royalty with nothing left to lose. When Bette Davis settled regally into the guest chair on The Tonight Show, cigarette holder poised between her fingers like a conductor's baton, the atmosphere in Studio One transformed. This wasn't just another celebrity promoting their latest project. This was Hollywood royalty deigning to share her unfiltered thoughts with the commoners. And share them she did, with a candor that frequently left Carson speechless and network executives reaching for antacid tablets. She had nothing left to prove, and she proved that out loud, observed a Tonight Show writer who witnessed many of her appearances. With 2 Academy Awards, decades of acclaimed performances, and a secure place in Hollywood history, Davis had reached that magical place in her career where she could say absolutely anything without fear of consequences. And boy, did she take advantage of that freedom. Unlike younger stars still building their careers and maintaining industry relationships, Davis had zero interest in the niceties of promotional appearances. She would name names, cite specific examples of mistreatment, and generally behave like someone who had kept detailed records of every slight she'd experienced throughout her long career and was finally ready to make those records public. During one memorable appearance, she told Johnny point blank, "Getting old in Hollywood is like being thrown out with the trash," recalled a producer who worked on that episode. The audience audibly gasped. This wasn't the usual carefully packaged celebrity interview with pre-approved talking points. This was raw truth from someone who had lived it, delivered with absolutely no concern for who might be offended. Davis's appearances created particular anxiety for network censors and standards departments. Where most guests respected unwritten rules against criticizing specific individuals, Davis would unhesitatingly call out directors, co-stars, and studio executives by name, often with razor-sharp assessments of their professional shortcomings or personal character flaws. "We had a special alert system just for Bet's appearances," revealed a former NBC Standards and Practices executive. "If she started a sentence with, 'Let me tell you about that bastard,' or 'I worked with an absolute fool named,' the director knew to be ready with a quick cut to Johnny's reaction to give us time to assess whether we needed to censor the upcoming comment. She knew exactly what she was doing. You could see that slight smile when she knew she'd made the censors nervous." What made Davis particularly effective as a truth-teller was her complete lack of desperation for approval. Unlike many celebrities who softened their criticisms with humor or qualified them to seem less harsh, Davis delivered her unvarnished opinions with the serene confidence of someone who had thoroughly considered her position and was entirely comfortable standing behind it, regardless of the reaction. You never got the sense she was being provocative for attention or saying outrageous things to generate headlines, noted a television critic who covered many of her Carson appearances. These were the considered judgments of someone who had spent decades observing the business from the inside and had finally reached a point where she felt not just permitted, but perhaps obligated to speak her truth about it. Carson's approach to Davis revealed his deep respect for authentic expertise and earned status. While he might gently challenge or redirect other guests whose candor threatened to become uncomfortable, with Davis he primarily assumed the role of fascinated listener, recognizing that her decades of experience gave her perspectives that deserved to be heard, however uncomfortable they might make some viewers or industry insiders. Johnny knew what the audience at home understood intuitively. "When Bette Davis speaks about Hollywood, you shut up and listen," explained a director who worked many of her appearances. He would occasionally try to lighten the mood if things got too dark, but he never attempted to silence her or change the subject entirely. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that she had earned the right to say whatever she damn well pleased on his show. Perhaps most remarkably, Davis managed to deliver even her most scathing assessments with a wit and style that transformed potential bitterness into compelling television. Unlike some stars who became visibly angry when discussing their grievances, Davis maintained a regal composure that made her criticisms all the more devastating for being delivered with such apparent ease. She once described a famous director, whom she did name, though I won't, as a man who mistook having a camera for having talent, recalled the writer. It was absolutely brutal, but delivered with such perfect timing and that distinctive Davis intonation that the audience actually applauded. She could eviscerate someone's entire career in a single, perfectly constructed sentence. Davis's appearances on The Tonight Show serve as fascinating documents of a particular type of celebrity candor, not the impulsive oversharing of youth or the boundary pushing of countercultural figures, but the measured, considered truth-telling of someone who had survived the entire arc of fame and emerged with her perspective intact and her priorities clarified. By the time she was appearing regularly on Carson, Bette had reached what I think of as the magnificent honesty phase of her career, reflected the critic. She had weathered both spectacular success and painful failure. She had been idolized and discarded, celebrated and forgotten. That journey gave her insights that were simply unavailable to younger stars, and unlike many of her contemporaries, she felt an obligation to share those insights rather than maintaining the industry's comfortable illusions. While Davis attacked Hollywood's sacred cows without mercy, our next guest did something even more dangerous. He turned America's most powerful TV host into his personal comedic punching bag right to his face.
Whatever that means. But Ed, I know and you know that someday he can't live forever, and I saw the x-rays a week.
Don Rickles, the man who roasted Johnny to his face. When Don Rickles bounded onto the Tonight Show stage, the atmosphere in Studio One transformed instantly. The energy level spiked, Carson's normally relaxed posture tensed slightly in anticipation, and the audience leaned forward collectively, knowing they were about to witness something rare in the carefully controlled world of network television. Completely unfiltered comedy aimed directly at the king of late night himself. "No filter, no fear," recalled a Tonight Show writer who worked during the height of Rickles' frequent appearances. Where every other guest treated Johnny with this reverent respect, Rickles would walk out and immediately start insulting him. His clothes, his hair, his multiple divorces, anything was fair game. And Johnny almost always loved it, even when the jokes occasionally drew blood. Rickles' unique relationship with Carson represented a stunning departure from the typical host-guest dynamic. While other celebrities carefully observed the unwritten rule that Carson was there to gently tease them rather than become the target himself, Rickles completely inverted this power structure from the moment he appeared. He'd come out, ignore Johnny's prepared questions, and launch right into, "Look at you with that awful suit. What is that, Johnny? Did you mug a game show host on your way to work?" remembered a camera operator who worked many of Rickles' appearances. The audience would gasp and then roar with laughter, partly at the joke itself, but also at the sheer audacity of anyone speaking to Carson that way on his own show. What made these exchanges work was the genuine friendship and mutual respect between the two men that underlay the seemingly brutal comedy. Carson understood that Rickles' insults were a form of affection, the comedian's unique way of acknowledging their special relationship, and the rare permission he had been granted to treat television's most powerful host as just another target. Carson used to say, "If Don isn't insulting you, that's when you should worry," explained a producer who worked closely with both men. Johnny recognized that being roasted by Rickles was actually a sign of respect. Don didn't bother with people he didn't consider worthy of his particular brand of attention. Being called a hockey puck by Rickles meant you were important enough to merit his best material. This understanding didn't mean Carson was entirely immune to feeling the sting when Rickles occasionally crossed into genuinely sensitive territory. Certain topics, particularly Carson's multiple divorces and his sometimes distant relationship with his children, were generally considered off-limits, even for Rickles. On the rare occasions when the comedian ventured into these areas, those who knew Carson well could detect a subtle cooling in his reaction. There was one appearance where Don made a particularly pointed joke about alimony payments, right after Johnny's third divorce had been finalized, the producer recalled. Johnny laughed, because he always laughed at Rickles' jokes publicly, but those of us who knew him well could see that little tightening around his eyes that meant the joke had hit a nerve. During the commercial break, Johnny leaned over and very quietly said something to Don. We couldn't hear what was said, but Rickles noticeably avoided that topic for the rest of the segment. These rare moments of tension never derailed the fundamental chemistry between the two men, however. Unlike his reaction to other guests who might accidentally touch a sensitive subject, Carson never held these occasional missteps against Rickles, recognizing them as the inevitable risk of the unique comedic freedom he had granted his friend. He roasted people to their face, and they begged for more, observed a fellow comedian who studied Rickles' technique. That was his particular genius. He could say things to people that would get anyone else punched in the face, but he delivered the insults with such obvious affection that the targets not only accepted them, but felt honored to be included. With Johnny, that dynamic reached its perfect expression, the most powerful man in television voluntarily becoming a punchline for his friend's comedy. What viewers at home didn't always appreciate was how carefully Rickles actually calibrated his performances on The Tonight Show. While his comedy appeared to be completely spontaneous and unfiltered, he was acutely aware of the limitations of network television and skillfully adapted his notoriously profane nightclub act to fit within those constraints without losing its essential energy. Don called Johnny Ed and Ed Johnny, and the audience names that only he could get away with, noted the writer, but he was actually very strategic about which insults would work on television versus in a Las Vegas showroom. He never used the truly rough language from his club shows, and he avoided topics that would have created genuine problems with the censors. The brilliance was that he created the illusion of complete, unfiltered chaos while actually remaining within the boundaries of what was permissible. The situation reached a critical point when Rickles orchestrated what he intended as a surprise tribute to Carson, but what became, in execution, something much closer to a roast. Without obtaining proper clearance from Carson or the producers, Rickles arranged for a series of embarrassing photos and stories from Carson's past to be compiled and displayed during what was supposed to be a standard interview segment. It was a complete ambush, recalled the director who worked that night. Johnny had no idea what was coming, and suddenly he's watching Rickles present material that was far more personal and pointed than anything we would have approved in advance. You could see him processing in real time, trying to be a good sport while also feeling genuinely blindsided by someone he considered a friend. According to multiple staff accounts, Carson was uncharacteristically quiet during the commercial break following this segment. When Rickles attempted to gauge his reaction, Carson reportedly said simply, "That wasn't funny, Don. That was mean." It was one of the few times staff had ever heard Carson directly criticize a guest's performance to their face. "For a few days after that incident, we genuinely thought Rickles might be permanently banned," admitted a talent coordinator. Johnny was that upset about it. It wasn't just the content of the surprise, it was the violation of trust. Carson ran a tightly controlled show, and Rickles had essentially hijacked it without permission to deliver material that crossed personal boundaries Johnny had clearly established. What saved Rickles from permanent exile was the genuine friendship that existed beneath the professional tension. Unlike some guests who Carson disliked on a fundamental level, his issues with Rickles were specific to certain behaviors rather than a general antipathy toward the person. This allowed for something rare in Carson's world: genuine reconciliation after a serious breach. Don eventually apologized, sincerely, privately, without excuses, said someone familiar with both men, and Johnny, who could hold grudges for decades over relatively minor slights, accepted that apology and moved forward. That speaks volumes about the real affection that existed between them, despite the occasional painful moments. If Rickles tested Carson with his comedic attacks, our next guest created an entirely different challenge: a manic genius whose mind moved so fast that the normal rules of television simply couldn't contain him. Robin Williams, the uncontainable comedic force. When Robin Williams exploded onto the Tonight Show stage, the carefully crafted structure of television's most controlled talk show instantly dissolved into glorious chaos. Unlike guests whose shamelessness manifested in shocking revelations or boundary-pushing comments, Williams represented a different kind of uncontainable energy, a volcanic eruption of pure comedic inspiration that simply could not be contained within the normal constraints of a television interview. Not shameful, but completely uncontainable, observed a Tonight Show director who worked many of Williams's appearances. Most guests would sit politely, answer questions, maybe tell a prepared anecdote. Robin would physically transform the set into his own universe. He'd take over the interview, jump on furniture, imitate Carson, and create this parallel reality that operated by completely different rules than normal television. What made Williams unique among Carson's guests was his absolute commitment to following his comedic instincts wherever they led, regardless of time constraints, planned segments, or the supposed structure of a talk show interview, where even the most difficult guests typically acknowledge the basic format of question and answer. Williams treated Carson's questions as mere jumping-off points for extended improvisational flights that could go literally anywhere. He didn't answer questions. He invented universes, noted a writer who worked with Carson during that period. Johnny would ask something simple like, "How was your flight?" expecting a brief response before moving to the prepared talking points. 15 minutes later, Robin would still be going, having transformed that simple query into an extended routine involving the flight attendants, other passengers, the pilots, air traffic controllers, and somehow the entire Russian Olympic team, all performed in different voices with physical comedy that had him literally rolling on the floor at one point. Carson's reaction to Williams revealed both his professional adaptability and his genuine admiration for unrestrained comedic talent. Rather than attempting to regain control or redirect Williams back to the planned interview structure, Carson would essentially surrender the segment entirely, transforming himself from host to delighted audience member, content to occasionally feed Williams a new premise when the current improvisation began to wind down. He took over the interviews, jumped on furniture, imitated Carson, and ignored every question, the director continued. And Johnny absolutely loved it. You could see this childlike delight on his face during Robin's appearances, this sense of, "I have no idea what's going to happen next," and that's wonderful. It was one of the few times you'd see Carson completely relinquish control of his show and just enjoy the ride. This surrender was particularly remarkable given Carson's usually firm hand on the show's rudder. For a host known for his precise timing and carefully measured responses, the decision to essentially hand over the reins to Williams' chaotic brilliance represented an unusual recognition that sometimes the most entertaining television comes from abandoning structure altogether. The control room would basically go into what we called Robin mode when he was on, revealed a technical director who worked the show. Normal camera blocking went out the window because you never knew where he would be at any given moment. He might start in the chair, but within minutes he could be under Carson's desk, climbing on the couch, or wandering into the band area to borrow Doc Severance's trumpet for a bit. We just assigned each camera operator to stay with him wherever he went and tried to capture as much as we could. This unpredictability created genuine challenges for the show's production team. Commercial breaks had to be called at whatever point Williams happened to take a breath, regardless of the planned schedule. Other segments sometimes had to be shortened or eliminated entirely because Williams had completely consumed the available time. Even the traditional format of moving from one guest to the next became complicated when Williams was involved. If Robin was the first guest of the night, we'd sometimes have to make a judgment call about whether to even bring out the second guest at all, remembered the director. There were nights when he was so brilliant and the audience was so completely engaged that bringing out another guest felt like a disservice to everyone. Johnny would occasionally make the call right there during a commercial break. Let's keep Robin and move the next guest to tomorrow night. That almost never happened with anyone else. What made Williams's appearances particularly remarkable was how he could transform even Carson's occasional attempts to regain control into new comedic opportunities. If Johnny tried to steer the conversation back to a planned topic or ask about Williams' current projects, the comedian would acknowledge the question for exactly one sentence before spinning off in an entirely new direction, often incorporating Carson's attempt at structure into his new improvisational run. There was this brilliant meta quality to how Robin handled Johnny's occasional efforts to get the interview back on track, observed the writer. He'd say something like, "Yes, the movie opens Friday, but speaking of Friday, did you ever notice how Friday in Moscow feels like Tuesday in a blender with Richard Nixon's left eyebrow?" And suddenly we're off on another completely unrelated 5-minute routine about Cold War politics, performed as a blender with Nixon's facial features. Johnny would just shake his head and laugh, recognizing he'd been outmaneuvered by a comedic genius. Despite the challenges Williams created for the show's structure, he remained one of Carson's favorite and most frequent guests. The host's genuine appreciation for Williams's unrestrained brilliance seemed to outweigh any professional frustration at the disruption of his carefully crafted program. In Williams, Carson appeared to recognize a pure comedic force that deserved complete freedom to express itself, even at the cost of his own hosting control. Johnny had this look he got with Robin that was different from his reaction to any other guest, noted someone who worked closely with Carson. It was this expression of pure wonder and delight, like he was witnessing something miraculous, rather than just another celebrity interview. He would literally move his chair back slightly, creating physical space for Robin to perform, a subtle acknowledgement that the normal rules were suspended when Williams was in the building. Williams might have been uncontrollable, but our next guest was simply unmovable, a comedy legend who would rather walk off the set than compromise his authentic self for network television rules. Red Fox, uncompromising authenticity without apologies. When Red Fox settled his compact frame into the guest chair on The Tonight Show, viewers witnessed something rarely seen in the polished world of network television: complete unfiltered authenticity from a performer who had spent decades developing his voice in venues far removed from mainstream America's living rooms. The star of Sanford and Son brought to Carson's couch the same uncompromising attitude that had made him a legend in black comedy clubs long before white America discovered him through television. "Refuse to tone it down," explained a Tonight Show booker who worked during Fox's appearances in the 1970s. Most performers understood that television required a more sanitized version of their club act. Red approached Carson's show with the attitude that he'd earned the right to be exactly who he was, regardless of medium. He wasn't deliberately provocative. He simply refused to present a version of himself that wasn't authentic, even if that created challenges for network television. This authenticity manifested in several ways that made Fox's appearances memorable and occasionally troublesome for the production team. Most immediately noticeable was his language, which remained considerably more colorful than the typical Tonight Show guest, despite the obvious constraints of broadcast standards. While Fox avoided the explicit profanity of his nightclub routines, He retained a bluntness in discussing sensitive topics that frequently had the censors hovering nervously over their delay buttons. He showed up when he wanted and left when he felt like it, noted the writer. There was this famous incident in 1975 when he lit a cigarette during a commercial break and was told by a production assistant that he couldn't smoke on camera when they came back from commercial. Red looked at the PA, then at Carson, and said, "I'm a grown man who smokes. That's who I am. If you don't want that on your show, I'll leave." And when they couldn't find a compromise, he actually did stand up, thank Johnny politely, and walk off the set. It wasn't angry or dramatic, just a matter-of-fact refusal to present a version of himself that wasn't authentic. While this incident might have ended some celebrity's relationship with The Tonight Show, Carson's respect for Fox's integrity actually seemed to increase after this demonstration of his principles. Fox returned to the show multiple times in subsequent years, and a subtle accommodation was eventually reached. While he still couldn't smoke on camera, the commercial break smoking restrictions were relaxed, and camera operators were instructed to avoid shots that would show the ashtray that was now provided at his request. Beyond language and specific behaviors like smoking, Fox brought to The Tonight Show a perspective on American society that was rarely represented in mainstream television of that era. As a black performer who had experienced decades of segregation, discrimination, and the complexities of race in America, Fox occasionally addressed topics that made network executives deeply uncomfortable, but that Carson seemed to recognize as valuable precisely because they were so rarely discussed on national television. Johnny had enormous respect for Red's life experience and perspective, observed the booker. Where some hosts might have nervously changed the subject when Fox began discussing racial issues too directly, Carson would often lean in, asking follow-up questions that allowed Red to expand on his observations. It was a remarkable example of Carson using his platform to amplify voices that weren't typically heard in mainstream media at that time. Behind Fox's occasional difficult moments was a fundamental integrity that even those who found him challenging had to respect. Unlike guests who created problems through substance issues or deliberately provocative behavior, Fox's uncompromising approach stemmed from a hard-earned belief in his right to present himself authentically after decades of being forced to accommodate others' expectations. There was something deeply admirable about his refusal to create a more palatable version of himself for white television audiences, reflected the writer. He had spent too many years adjusting his art and his presence to make white audiences comfortable, and by the time he reached Carson's show, he was simply done with that. The attitude was essentially, "I'm Red Fox. I've earned the right to be exactly who I am. Take it or leave it." Carson's willingness to take it, to accept Fox on his own terms, rather than demanding he conform to television's typical expectations, created some of the most honest and compelling interviews of the Carson era. These conversations provided a rare opportunity for mainstream American audiences to encounter a perspective that was typically excluded from network television, delivered by someone unwilling to soften its edges for easier consumption. Johnny once described Red as completely without pretense or performance, just pure authenticity, recalled someone who worked closely with Carson. Coming from a host who was himself quite guarded and controlled, this was perhaps the highest compliment he could offer. Carson recognized in Fox something he himself struggled to achieve, the courage to be exactly who you are, regardless of the setting or the potential consequences. While Fox refused to compromise his authenticity, our next guest was deliberately provoking America's favorite host, a young pop star determined to shock Carson's comfortable middle American world.
I don't know. I never thought about doing one, but I figured if I was going to present myself as a virgin to anyone, it should be you.
Madonna, the material girl who shocked America's host. When Madonna made her first appearance on The Tonight Show in 1987, she arrived not as a nervous newcomer grateful for the exposure, but as a cultural provocateur determined to shake up Carson's comfortable middle American institution. Fresh off her controversial Who's That Girl tour, and at the height of her boundary-pushing phase, Madonna seemed less interested in promoting her latest projects than in testing how far she could push network television's boundaries. Her first appearance included sexual jokes, cursing, and taunting Johnny, remembered a production assistant who worked that night. NBC bleeped several lines, but she just laughed and kept going. She didn't care about approval, just attention. Unlike the older guests on our list who had earned their candor through decades in the business, Madonna's shamelessness was a deliberately crafted component of her artistic persona, a calculated strategy to position herself as an agent of cultural disruption, challenging the established norms that Carson's show represented. What made her appearance so jarring was the generational clash it represented, observed a cultural critic who studied Madonna's career. Carson embodied a certain kind of mid-century entertainment value system, polite, controlled, subtly suggestive but never explicit. Madonna represented the demolition of those very boundaries. She wasn't just pushing against Carson's format, she was challenging the entire cultural paradigm he represented. This approach created fascinating television as Carson, always the consummate professional, attempted to maintain his usual charming control, while Madonna deliberately threw obstacle after obstacle in his path. Where Johnny typically established easy rapport with guests through gentle humor, Madonna maintained a provocative edge throughout their interaction, challenging his questions and making explicitly sexual references that left him momentarily speechless. There was this moment where he asked a fairly innocent question about her tour, and she responded with a double entendre so blatant that Carson actually blushed, recalled the production assistant. The audience gasped, then roared with laughter. You could almost see Madonna mentally checking a box. Mission accomplished. She had managed to fluster the unflappable Johnny Carson. What made the appearance particularly notable was Madonna's complete comfort with the awkward silences that followed her more provocative statements. Where most guests would nervously fill a shocked pause with clarification or backtracking, she would simply maintain eye contact with Carson, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, clearly enjoying the momentary discomfort her words had created. Most celebrities feared awkward silences above all else, noted a television critic who covered the appearance. Madonna weaponized them. She understood that those uncomfortable pauses after a shocking statement were when viewers leaned in closest, when the energy of the interview peaked. She wasn't just comfortable with those moments, she deliberately engineered them. Behind the scenes, the appearance created considerable tension among the network censors and standards department. Madonna's deliberately provocative language forced them to make real-time decisions about what could air in the late-night time slot, resulting in several noticeable bleeps that themselves became part of the interview's controversial nature. The standards team was in absolute panic mode, revealed a former NBC executive who was present that night. They were hitting the delay button so often that it became almost comical, which I suspect was exactly what Madonna intended. Each bleep just emphasized what she was doing, turning the censorship itself into part of the performance. She was essentially forcing the network to become an unwitting participant in her boundary pushing. Carson, who had built his career on making guests feel comfortable enough to reveal themselves, found himself in the unusual position of being the one thrown off balance. His typical interviewing strategy of gentle guidance and supportive responses proved largely ineffective with a guest who had arrived with her own agenda and wasn't particularly interested in playing by the established rules of the talk show format. Johnny tried his usual approach of charming deflection when things got too risque, but Madonna would just push right past it and return to whatever provocative topic he was trying to move away from, the executive continued. If he tried to change the subject after a sexual reference, she'd say something like, "Oh, does that make you uncomfortable, Johnny?" turning his discomfort into the new topic. Despite the challenges her appearance created, Carson maintained his professional composure throughout, demonstrating the adaptability that had made him television's preeminent host for decades. Rather than becoming visibly frustrated or attempting to regain complete control, he shifted into what staff referred to as his hurricane management mode, letting the force of nature run its course, while ensuring the segment stayed entertaining for the audience at home. She didn't shame herself, she shamed the system's prudishness, reflected the critic. That was the brilliance of Madonna's approach. By saying things that required censorship, she exposed the boundaries themselves as the actual issue. It wasn't that she had no shame, it was that she deliberately rejected the idea that certain topics should be shameful in the first place. If Madonna's provocations were calculated, our final guest's candor came from a much darker place. A brilliant literary mind gradually surrendering to his demons in prime time.
What I originally wanted to be when I was a child, I was mad about vaudeville and tap dances.
Truman Capote, literary genius, unleashed. When Truman Capote settled his diminutive frame into the guest chair on The Tonight Show, viewers witnessed the fascinating spectacle of one of America's most brilliant literary minds gradually abandoning all filters between his thoughts and his words. The author of Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood brought to Carson's show a unique combination of razor-sharp intellect, vicious wit, and an increasingly apparent struggle with substance abuse that resulted in some of the most uncomfortable yet compelling interviews of the Carson era. He was either drunk, dangerous, or both, observed a producer who worked with Carson during this period. What made Capote particularly unpredictable was that the alcohol didn't completely dull his intellect. It just removed any concern about the consequences of what he said. So you'd get these moments of stunning insight immediately followed by scandalous revelations about public figures that had the network lawyers running in circles. Unlike guests whose candor was calculated for effect, Capote's increasingly uninhibited appearances seemed to reflect a genuine dissolution of the barriers between his private thoughts and public statements. As his struggles with alcohol and drugs became more apparent, his already minimal social filters eroded entirely, resulting in interviews that veered between literary brilliance and troubling incoherence. Slurred, stumbled, and dropped unfiltered gossip bombs, recalled a Tonight Show writer who witnessed several of Capote's appearances in the 1970s. The terrifying thing was, everyone knew he actually did have dirt on Hollywood stars and Washington politicians. This wasn't empty boasting. He had been the confidant of movie stars, socialized with presidents and first ladies, attended the most exclusive gatherings for decades. When he started naming names and describing what he'd seen at private events, there was genuine panic among certain circles about what he might reveal next. Capote's status as a literary giant who had moved comfortably through the highest echelons of both Hollywood and Washington society made his unfiltered comments particularly explosive. Unlike gossip columnists trading in secondhand rumors, Capote had actually attended the private parties, visited the secluded homes, and witnessed firsthand the private behavior of many of America's most powerful and famous figures. Carson's approach to handling Capote evolved as the author's condition deteriorated over the years. In earlier appearances, when Capote was still at the height of his literary powers, Carson engaged him in genuinely substantive conversations about writing, fame, and American culture. As Capote's struggles became more apparent, Carson shifted to a more protective interviewing style, gently guiding him away from his most self-destructive tangents while still allowing his brilliance to shine through when possible. Johnny had enormous respect for Capote's talent, explained someone who worked closely with Carson. Even when Truman was clearly impaired, Johnny would try to find moments to steer the conversation toward literature or writing, areas where Capote could still display the genius that had made him famous in the first place. It was like watching someone try to find small islands of lucidity in an increasingly chaotic mind. The most challenging aspects of Capote's appearances came when he would make startling confessions about his own behavior, or make claims about public figures that crossed from gossip into potentially libelous territory. These moments created real-time dilemmas for the production team and network standards department, who had to balance the compelling television Capote created against the legal and ethical risks he presented. There was one appearance where he started describing in explicit detail a sexual encounter involving a very prominent political couple, remembered the NBC executive. Carson let him go for about 30 seconds, fascinated like everyone else, before realizing we were heading into potentially actionable territory. The skill with which Johnny then redirected him, making it seem like a natural conversation shift rather than a deliberate interruption, was masterful. Capote probably never even realized he'd been steered away from legal disaster. What made Capote's appearances particularly poignant was the visible deterioration of his once towering talent over successive bookings. Viewers who had followed his career could track the gradual decline of one of America's most brilliant literary minds through his Tonight Show appearances, watching as his trademark wit became more erratic and his insights more scattered. It was like watching a supernova in slow motion, reflected the writer. This extraordinary talent gradually burning itself out right before your eyes. You'd still get these flashes of the old Capote brilliance, a perfectly phrased observation or a devastatingly witty assessment of some cultural phenomenon, but they'd be embedded in increasingly disjointed rambling. It was simultaneously fascinating and heartbreaking. For Carson, who prided himself on presenting guests in their best light, Capote presented a unique challenge: how to showcase a genuine literary genius whose self-destructive behavior threatened to overwhelm his talent. The solution Carson found was to treat Capote with unfailing respect for his achievements, while gently establishing boundaries around his most problematic tendencies. Johnny never treated him as a joke or a cautionary tale, noted someone who knew both men. Even at his most impaired, Capote was always introduced with references to his literary accomplishments, always addressed as a serious artist first and a personality second. Carson seemed to understand that beneath the increasingly troubled exterior was a writer who had genuinely changed American literature, and that primary identity deserved respect regardless of his current condition.